My son stayed silent as his wife kicked me out, until he discovered what I had done. Daniel didn't look at me when his wife told me to pack my things. He looked at the floor, at his shoes, at the crack in the ceiling plaster he'd been promising to fix for 2 years anywhere but at my face. That was the moment I understood I had already lost him, long before that night. I'm Alina Voss. I was 68 years old the evening my daughter-in-law Priya stood in the kitchen doorway of the house I had helped pay for and told me I had until Sunday to find somewhere else to live. She said it in the calm, reasonable voice she used for everything, the voice that made her sound like she was doing me a favor. "It's not personal, Alina," she said. "We just need the space. The girls are getting older, they need separate rooms, and honestly, it would be good for everyone to have their own lives back." Their own lives back, as if I had stolen theirs. As if the last 6 years, since Robert died and I sold our house and moved in temporarily to help with the twins, had been some kind of hostile occupation instead of what it actually was. 6 years of 9 a.m. pediatrician runs, of casseroles in the freezer for nights Daniel worked late, of homework help and fevers in the middle of the night, and every single one of Priya's work trips covered without a single complaint from me. I looked at my son. Daniel was 41 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a beer he wasn't drinking, and he said nothing. Not Priya, that's not fair. Not Mom, let's talk about this. Not even give her more time. He just sat there jaw tight, eyes down, letting his wife dismantle his mother's life in 12 sentences while he studied a water stain on the ceiling. "I want to tell you," I said something dignified. I didn't. I said, "I'll be out by Sunday," and I went upstairs to the room that had been mine for 6 years, and I closed the door, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without crying, because crying felt like it would have proven Priya's point, that I was fragile, that I was a burden, that I was something to be managed and relocated. What I did instead was open the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one with the false bottom Robert had built into it 30 years ago for reasons I never fully understood and never asked about, God rest him, and I took out the folder that had been sitting there for 6 years. I looked at it for a long time, then I put it back and I started to pack. You should know something about Daniel, so this makes sense. My son was not always the kind of man who stays silent while his mother is put out on the street. When he was 9, he broke his arm defending a smaller boy on the playground from 3 older ones, and he never once cried about the arm, only about not being able to finish the fight. When he was 26, fresh out of business school with more ambition than sense, he came to me and his father with a business plan for a specialty hardware supply company, the kind of thing that sounds boring until you understand it was going to be his entire life, and he asked us, humbly terrified, if we would consider investing. We didn't have much. Robert was a high school shop teacher, and I did the books for 3 small businesses in town, including, eventually, our sons. But we had the house paid off, and we had 40 years of frugality behind us. And when Daniel needed $110,000 to keep Voss Fasteners and Supply from going under in its 2nd year, a bad contract, a supplier who folded, a cash flow gap that would have ended the company before it started, Robert and I took out a second mortgage on the house we had lived in for 3 decades. We didn't tell him where the money came from. We told him it was an inheritance from Robert's uncle, a small lie that let him take the help without the weight of knowing what it had cost us. He never knew. Robert died 4 years later, and by then the mortgage was most of the way paid down again, quietly, through years of me working past retirement age doing bookkeeping I didn't need to do, because I never wanted my son to feel he owed his life to his mother's sacrifice. I wanted him to feel like a man who had built something. That felt like the more important gift. Voss Fasteners and Supply is a mid-sized company now, 41 employees, a warehouse and 2 retail locations. Daniel drives a car that costs more than the house I grew up in. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in my old bedroom, now, I supposed, about to become a home gym or a guest room or whatever Priya had planned, there was a folder containing the promissory note Daniel had signed at 26, a note he'd paid back in full within 8 years, made out not to a fictional great uncle but to Robert and Alina Voss, with our real signatures, our real bank routing numbers, the whole true history of where his company's survival had actually come from. I had never shown it to him. I had never needed to. That wasn't why I kept it. I found a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaners on Fenmore Street, the kind of place that smells faintly of steam and starch no matter what time of day you walk in. And I moved in on a Saturday with the help of a moving company. I paid for out of the money I'd quietly set aside over the years, money Priya, I am fairly sure, assumed I didn't have, since I had never once corrected her assumption that I was a woman with nothing but a small pension and my son's charity. Daniel called on Sunday. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. He asked if I was settling in okay. I said I was fine. Neither of us said the thing that actually needed saying, which is that 6 days earlier he had watched his wife evict his own mother and hadn't said a word, and that I didn't know anymore who exactly my son had become. I want to be fair to him, even now. I have come to think in the months since that Daniel's silence that night wasn't cruelty. It was cowardice, which is different, though it doesn't feel different when you're the one sitting in a room being talked about like furniture. He and Priya had been fighting for months. I later learned about money, about her mother wanting to move in from Ohio, about 100 small resentments that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with me, because I was the visible, arguable issue standing in for all the invisible ones. Daniel had picked the path of least immediate conflict, which was to let his wife win the argument in front of me rather than have the argument with her in private later, without an audience. It is a common cowardice. It is not a forgivable one, but it is common, and I have tried in my heart to hold both of those truths at once. For 3 months I lived above the dry cleaners, and I did not call my son. And he did not call me except for the obligatory Sunday check-ins that felt more like probation reports than conversations. My granddaughters, Ruthie and Wren, 8 years old, called me twice. Priya must have allowed it, or not known, and I cried both times after we hung up, real crying, the kind I hadn't let myself do the night I was told to leave. I kept busy. I did the books for a bakery 2 streets over. I joined a Tuesday walking group at the community center. I did not tell anyone the whole story, because there is a particular flavor of humiliation in explaining that your own son let his wife throw you out, and I found I preferred people simply thinking I downsized after my husband passed, which was, after all, also true. But I did do one thing quietly in those 3 months. I called my nephew Marcus, who is a paralegal, and I asked him, in a roundabout way that I'm sure didn't fool him for a second, some questions about promissory notes and statutes of limitations and what happens legally to a debt that was fully repaid 15 years ago. He told me gently that there was nothing to pursue. The debt was paid, there was no legal claim. Was I sure I was all right, Aunt Alina? I told him I was fine. I told him I was just curious. That was another lie, though a smaller one than the great-uncle story, and closer to true. What I was actually doing was deciding something. I was deciding whether to show my son the folder. Here is what changed everything, and it wasn't a dramatic confrontation, not at first. It was much smaller than that. It was a leaking pipe. My old house, the one I'd raised Daniel in, and then handed over to him when Robert died, and I moved into his house instead, in one of those quiet transfers of property that families do without ceremony, had a burst pipe in the basement in February, and the water had gotten into some boxes that had been sitting down there since before I moved out, boxes I'd never fully unpacked because some part of me, I think, always suspected the arrangement with Priya wouldn't last forever. Daniel called me, this time not for the Sunday ritual but for something real. He was down in the flooded basement, going through waterlogged boxes trying to figure out what could be saved, and he found the filing cabinet, the old grey one from Robert's classroom, dented on one corner, that I'd never bothered moving to the apartment because there wasn't room. Most of the water hadn't reached it. But the bottom drawer had swollen and cracked, and when Daniel pried it open to check the damage, the folder was sitting right there on top, dry, untouched, like it had been waiting. He didn't call me that night. He called me 3 days later, and his voice was different, quieter, and there was a long silence on the line before he said anything at all. "Mom," he said, "I need to come see you, today if that's okay." I said it was. He arrived at the apartment above the dry cleaners an hour later, and he was carrying the folder, and his eyes were red in a way I hadn't seen since his father's funeral. He sat down across from me at the little kitchen table I'd bought second-hand, and he put the folder between us and he said, "Is this real?" "It's real," I said. "You and Dad, this is your signatures. This is $110,000. This is," he stopped. He put both hands flat on the table like he needed something to hold on to. "You told me it was Uncle Frank's inheritance." "There was no inheritance," I said. "Your father's Uncle Frank left him a fishing rod and $42. We took out a second mortgage on the house. We paid on it for 11 years. I worked 6 more years past when I planned to retire so we could close it out faster. Why would you lie to me about that?" And here is the part I had thought about for 6 years, sitting on the edge of borrowed beds in his house in the years before the eviction, and I told him the truth of it now the same way I would have told him then if he had ever asked, which he never had. "Because I didn't want you carrying it," I said. "I wanted you to build that company believing it was yours, not something you owed us. I didn't want gratitude standing between you and your own success, Daniel. I wanted you to feel like a man who'd done something, not a boy who'd been rescued." He put his face in his hands. I let him sit like that for a while. I didn't reach for him. I have learned at my age that comfort offered too soon can feel like forgiveness offered too soon, and I wasn't ready yet to hand that to him for free. When he finally looked up, he said, "You could have used this 6 months ago. You could have shown me this the night Priya." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," I said. "Why didn't you?" And this is the honest answer, the one I turned over in my mind more nights than I want to admit, sitting alone above the dry cleaners listening to the machines hum through the floor. "Because I didn't want you to stand up for me because you owed me," I said. "I wanted you to stand up for me because I'm your mother, and it was the right thing to do, and you loved me enough to do the right thing even when your wife was angry about it. If I'd waved that folder around that night, you'd have defended me out of debt, not out of love. And I would rather have been put out on the street by a woman I don't much like than have my own son think that's the only reason I was worth defending." Daniel didn't say anything for a long time after that. Then he said, very quietly, "I stayed silent because it was easier than fighting with her, not because I thought you deserved it. I want you to know that. I've hated myself every day since." "I believe you," I said, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did. What happened after that wasn't a fairy tale. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this one too often end with a neat bow, and life very rarely does. Daniel didn't leave Priya. I want to say that clearly, because I know some people reading this will want the satisfying version where the son marches home and delivers an ultimatum, and the daughter-in-law is cast out into the same cold she cast his mother into. That isn't what happened, and honestly I wouldn't have wanted it to. Priya is the mother of my granddaughters. Breaking that marriage wouldn't have undone what was done to me. It would only have made 2 little girls suffer for their parents' failures the way children always do. What Daniel did instead was harder in its way and slower. He told Priya about the folder. He told her he understood now what his mother had sacrificed for him, and that regardless of that debt, regardless of any of it, what had happened in their kitchen that night should never have happened, and that he should have said so then instead of 6 months later. He told her that his mother would be welcome in their home on her own terms, whenever she wanted to visit, and that he would not be silent again, not for his mother, and he added, not for his daughters either, when they were old enough to need him to speak up on their behalf. Priya called me 2 weeks after that. It was not an easy call for either of us. She did not exactly apologize, not in so many words, I don't think that's in her nature, but she said she'd been under more pressure than she'd let on, about money and about her own mother, and about feeling erased in a house that had, in her words, always felt more like Alina's than mine, even after you moved out. I told her I understood that better than she might think, because I had spent 6 years in that house trying very hard not to make her feel exactly that way, and clearly I had failed at it more than I knew. It wasn't warmth, that phone call, but it was honesty on both sides, which felt like more than we'd had before. I still live above the dry cleaners. I like it there, more than I expected to. The smell of steam in the mornings, the walking group on Tuesdays, the bakery books I do on Thursday afternoons for a woman named Corrine who bakes the best rye bread I've had since Robert's mother used to make it. Daniel visits every Sunday now, not out of ritual guilt, but because he asks genuinely whether it's a good time, and I tell him yes almost always because it is. The girls come too sometimes. Ruthie asked me once, with the blunt honesty only an 8-year-old can manage, why I didn't live with them anymore, and I told her the truth in a version small enough for her to hold, that grown-ups sometimes need their own separate spaces to be happy, and that didn't mean anybody stopped loving anybody else. She seemed to accept that. Children usually understand more than we give them credit for. I kept the folder. It's in a drawer in my new apartment now. No false bottom this time, nothing hidden. Daniel knows exactly where it is. He asked me once if I wanted him to pay me back somehow money, a gesture, something symbolic, and I told him no, that the debt had been settled 15 years ago, and settling it twice wasn't the point. The point was never the money. It never had been. The point was that I had spent his whole life trying to give him things quietly enough that he'd never feel the weight of them, and it had taken a flooded basement and a folder in an old filing cabinet to teach him that love this large doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits in a drawer for 6 years, waiting, saying nothing, exactly the way I once did. He tells me now most Sundays before he leaves that he's sorry and that he loves me and that he won't stay silent again. I believe him more each time he says it. Trust, I've found, doesn't come back all at once, the way it leaves. It comes back the way the money did, all those years ago, slowly in installments, paid down a little at a time, until one day you look up and realize the debt is gone, and what's left standing in its place was built by both of you together on purpose.